IMF announced a steep downgrade to 3.6% to its global growth forecast for this year as a result of the war in Ukraine and accelerated inflation in many countries, as well as other factors. With no end in sight for the war, what could be done to improve the global economic outlook? How can inflation be managed? And how can we better respond to global shocks and uncertainty? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very pleased to be joined today by Steve Barnett, Senior Resident Representative in China of the International Monetary Fund. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Hello, welcome to the show, Stephen.
Thank you.
Well, the IMF, has downgraded the growth forecast for this year to 3.6%, a very steep drop if we compared that to 6.1% last year. So what are the major concerns behind such a cut?
That's correct. It is a steep drop in growth. It's also a big drop in this year's growth forecasts. So, just back in January, we were forecasting global growth to be 4.4%. So our current forecast is a reduction of 0.8 percentage points in just a few months. Now, we also marked down growth for next year to 3.6%, which is 0.2 percentage points lower. These downgrades are widespread. We marked down growth this year for more than 140 economies, accounting for over 85% of global GDP. So for analytical purposes, we like to split the world into two groups. One is the emerging market and developing economies. For this group, we marked down growth by 1 percentage point. And for the group of advanced economies, we marked down by a little bit less, 0.6 percentage points. This also highlights how the pandemic, the repercussions of the war in Ukraine are having a bigger impact on emerging market and developing economies than they are on advanced economies. You also asked me what can be done. I think first is to end the war in Ukraine. We know that conflict is bad for development and that this conflict is having reverberations felt globally. Second, we need to confront COVID. To fight it, we need a variety of tools, including vaccines, testing, antiviral treatments, and importantly, these need to be deployed everywhere. This pandemic provides really a great illustration of how health security is so important for economic security. The last issue, as you mentioned in your introduction, is to tackle inflation.
Well, recently, IMF has done research which suggests countries diversify their supply chains because having more source countries and inputs can significantly reduce the economic drag from supply disruptions. Would you please elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, that was actually the same chapter I was just referring to that found that global value chains were resilient during the crisis. That chapter also explored ways to make them being global value chains, more resilient. And as you noted, one way was to diversify away from domestic sourcing of inputs. And another way was to have greater substitutability of an input. That is making it easier to switch supplies, if you will, between countries. And why is that? Basically, having more options for buying input goods means that there would be less disruption when a single supplier or country is hit by a shock. This is kind of a classic gains from diversification argument. The chances of multiple suppliers being hit or multiple countries being hit by a shock at the same time is much lower. So that makes sense to diversify. And this also, the same logic applies to domestic input sourcing, suggesting that diversification gains from sourcing more inputs from abroad rather than reshoring, actually getting more from abroad. One other thing they did is we know that by and large, supply chains are based on firm level decisions. But there are steps the government can take to strengthen global supply chains and global value chains. And I'll flag two. One is enhancing infrastructure. Upgrading and modernizing port infrastructure on key routes can help reduce these global choke points. And the second is to reduce trade costs. This includes reducing non-tariff barriers, as well as reducing trade policy uncertainty.
Well, a related question, Stephen, there are people discussing or wondering whether the globalization has been ended, because of the pandemic, because of the war. There are also ideological differences, geopolitical tensions. Some countries are trying to build a so-called value-based supply chain. and more or less the world is becoming a little bit more divided. Are you worried about that?
Yeah, I mean, I should say, our research on supply chains suggests that this reshoring is what we call it, that you talked about, is not the solution. So moving production of inputs onshore instead of importing is not the way to go. What we've seen again with the war in Ukraine, aside from it causing tragic humanitarian crisis in Eastern Europe, is that it's also added to this series of supply shocks that have hit the global economy and is fueling some of that sentiment that you talked about. It's leading to rising food and energy prices, which we know have a strong impact. We also know that the impact, because of these supply chain linkages, goes beyond energy and agriculture, and that we see how disruptions in one country can quickly cascade globally, just illustrating how interconnected the world is. But I think, therefore, a big challenge and a key challenge for the world is to exactly avoid a more permanent fragmentation of the world economy into these geopolitical blocks. Separate blocks could have distinct technology standards, distinct cross-border payment systems, separate reserve currencies. Such a major shift would be really costly. The adjustments costs would be huge, and we would lose a lot in efficiency, as well as we have to move supply chains and switch production networks. So, again, as I mentioned in the opening, to me, a key message of our spring meeting is to avoid this and just emphasize that multilateral cooperation really remains essential.
Well, let's take a look at the performance of the Chinese economy. Its first quarter GDP growth is 4.8% year on year. Of course, the official target remains like a 5.5%, and also the Chinese central government obviously is aware of increasing uncertainty and challenges both domestically and externally. So do you think there are enough tools for the Chinese central government probably to exercise in order to not exactly 5.5%, probably to achieve the maximum, at best, let's say?
Right. Even before the outbreak, and the government work report itself said in reference to the target that achieving this goal will require arduous efforts. But you mentioned the policy space. In fact, I would say, if I look at the macro management right now, I see kind of two broad areas of challenges. First is the near term, and this is exactly what you're referring to. How can China support the economy? And I think the short answer, China has the policy space. I would say fiscal policy in particular can provide an important boost to growth this year, especially by focusing on policies to lift consumption and promote greener growth. I think on consumption, one example would be fiscal policy measures to strengthen the social protection system. This would provide a really nice lift to households and a nice boost to consumption. I think the second area is it's really important not to lose sight of the medium term. And here, I think there are three key challenges. The first is to continue to press ahead with structural reforms. These will unleash market forces that can fuel sustainable growth going forward. The second actually builds on my last point about consumption. If we look at in China, China's really had remarkable growth in household consumption over the last few decades. However, it turns out that consumption actually in general hasn't grown as fast as GDP. And what we see is that China's consumption share of GDP is very low by international standards. So over the medium term, a key challenge is to boost consumption, and that actually would be a good thing. That would mean that living standards are actually growing faster than GDP. And the last point is to grow in a way that addresses climate change.
Well, that's Stephen Barnett, Senior Resident Representative in China of the International Monetary Fund. Coming up on Dialogue, China has announced a package of detailed policy measures to further stabilize the economy. What are the highlights and how will they mitigate impacts brought by the resurgence of a pandemic? And what are the chances the country will reach its GDP growth target of 5.5% this year? To discuss these measures and more, I'm joined by Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, and Wang Dan, Chief Economist of Hang Seng Bank, China. So welcome to the show. Wang Dan, I will start with you. Okay, a slew of measures have been introduced by the State Council, by the Chinese government, 33 of them in 6 areas, this consumption, investment, food and energy security, livelihoods. So how do you characterize these measures? What's your take of them?
A lot of those measures are targeting for midterm and long-term growth instead of short-term, because we know the immediate impact for boosting the economy has to come from the direct cash spending or some support related with logistics and transportation industries, because they were the ones that were hit the most and the ones that were the easiest to be recovered. But when it comes to the durable goods consumption, it just seems that in the short term, consumers won't be that willing to spend because there is a slowdown in the income growth. A lot of the projects are also focusing on water projects, energy projects, and those are mostly in the range of 3 to 5 years, and that can be done to boost the longer term growth potential, but not really to boost the growth this year. So I would say this comprehensive basket of measures are quite effective to revive the economy, but we do need stronger boost for the economy in the short term. And in the second half of the year, this is particularly important.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, what's your take of these measures? One key word for this government policies is like to stabilize the economy. So it seems to me it's not really targeting at boosting faster economic growth. Instead, it's trying to say reduce the disruption because of the pandemic.
Yeah, I totally agree with Mrs. Wang regarding the long-term nature of some of the measures. I think at this point it's not so much about stimulating the economy. It's more about trying to resume production, trying to recover to a normal life, I think. And many companies, small companies, micro businesses have closed down because of that, because of the measures we have been taking. So, at this point, I think it's just trying to remove and eradicate all those barriers, unnecessary barriers, to a normal production life. And I think that's the most important thing. So in my view, out of the measures outlined in this document, I think the most important thing is to forbid local governments from implementing those intrusive, interventive measures that just slow and stop everything down. So that's the most important thing, I think.
Mm-hmm. Wang Dan, John mentioned about that. One of the measures probably is to reduce those restrictions, probably, especially at the local level in different provinces, cities. Just to allow the business to go back to normal.
Well, there are a lot of restrictions across the board. Some restrictions are related with COVID control, and these, I'm afraid, are hard to be lifted entirely because we know COVID control is the #1 priority in the agenda. And then there are restrictions on digital economy, and according to the central government, this regulatory framework has been developed so rapidly in the past year. Now it's coming to an end stage. So that means probably there will be more relaxation in that front. And then there's also the restriction that came with the prolonged lockdown. Because even if the consumers want to spend more, they don't have the kind of financial cushion to help them to do so. There was not a strong support for income or a strong program in cash transfer or consumer coupon. And that means once we are more or less back to the normal schedule of production, consumers will be still hesitant to spend.
Mm-hmm. What about this, tax relief measures with an amount of 114 billion yuan, about 21 billion US dollars, Wang Dan? What kind of a role that will play in stabilizing the economy?
These fee cut and tax cut and direct support for companies in terms of reducing their costs are very necessary in the short term, because many of those companies, mostly the smaller producers, are facing the lack of liquidity problem. So they need this kind of blood transfusion for them to tide over this most difficult time. But let's not forget, China's long-term problem is the overcapacity in its industrial production. And now we're still facing the same problem because foreign demand has been declining. If we look at the growth rate of export, it has been declining very fast. And that means even if we can encourage most of the producers to go back to normal and produce a lot of the goods and services, domestic demand was not enough to support this kind of growth. So that means the ultimate solution still lies on the demand side. Very nice to have the corporates sustain their lifeline, but still we need somebody to buy it, either consumers or other type of business to buy it.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, obviously it's important to boost domestic consumption, and then there are some incentives for the consumers to purchase more durable goods, like including automobiles and home appliances. Some incentives, are they enough to incentivize consumers to spend?
Well, I beg to disagree with the point that China's exports slowing down is because of lessened demand overseas. I mean, we have to also think about how much of that reduced exports is due to the disruption in the domestic production side. You know, people have been predicting China's exports is going to slow down, but look at, you know, the entire few quarters, the 8 quarters of the past time. You know, it's just very robust growth quarter after quarter. Up until now, you know, when we start to have those, slowed domestic production as a result of the pandemic, before that, it's still going very strong. So I mean, look at some of the great products coming from China. I mean, the electric car market, for example, you know, the solar panels, the entire world is transitioning to solar power right now due to the war in Ukraine, and some other mechanical products. I mean, they're very competitive products. And you know, the business people in China never failed us in delivering a very competitive performance in international markets. So I don't think that there's some overcapacity problem, but we've been dealing with this overcapacity problem for years. I think when President Xi first came to power, he was talking about supply side adjustment, and that's mainly targeting the overcapacity issue. We have been doing this for so many years up to this point. So I'm not so much convinced that the slowdown is because of the demand side overseas. I think it's more of the domestic policy. It's more of the pandemic situation, unfortunately in China, that's going on right now, that's causing the problem. So I think we need to have a hard debate about the policies, about how do we move forward, how sustainable these measures are, and make some hard decisions. I think at the end of the day, if the policy is, even if it's very effective, but if it's not sustainable, it's not going to work. So I think that's a very important perspective, probably should be taken into account by the policymakers in China.
Well, Wang, then back to you. I think John has mentioned a good point here, like the Chinese export trade with the rest of the world. If you look at the US inflation, part of the problem people attribute to is really about the disruption of international supply, including the restrictions introduced in China. That means like Chinese production and also the transportation of the goods to the US, right?
That's absolutely part of the problem. The disruption in transport and shipping has contributed partly to the US inflation, but that's only a small factor in the whole story of the US inflation. A bigger portion of that story was because of oversupply of money. And we have to remember that inflation is ultimately a monetary phenomenon. And on top of that, there is also the increasing wages in the US. So China's decrease in production is true due to COVID control, but the decline because of COVID is very limited and very concentrated in the Yangtze River Delta. So I wouldn't say that the foreign demand is so strong that can sustain China's exports throughout the rest of the year, because if we think about it, before the pandemic started, export only contributed about 10% of China's GDP growth. It was only after the pandemic, China's export suddenly became the most important driver, contributing to more than 50% of the GDP growth. That's unusual. And a lot of that growth was related with the COVID control stuff, the medical devices, masks, things like that. But now this kind of demand has been declining, and home appliances was in strong demand in those markets during the lockdown, in especially the US. But now these demand has been dropping as well. And on top of that, there's also the Federal Reserve hiking rates. So I can only see a weaker demand throughout the rest of the year for China's export. And then that will be translating to another overcapacity problem because domestically we can consume a lot of products. So we have to stimulate demand rather than stimulating supply at this point.
Well, John, if you look at the domestic, job market here, we are going to, have this 10 million new college graduates for this year. What's the expectation? What's the prospect for the job market?
It's extremely difficult. I mean, there's already some anecdotal evidence to illustrate that the unemployment rate among the graduating students this year is very disappointing. I think, it's just actually also from my personal experience in terms of interactions with our own students. It's a very tough job market at this point. I know many students are thinking about going to the government route, in other words, to take the civil employment exams to take up government positions if there are still any out there, and that's very troublesome to me. If people are only looking at government jobs, there's something wrong with our economy. So I think the 11 million, 10 million new jobs that have to be created every year has always been a daunting task in the past. But I think more or less every year we're always being able to achieve more or less that goal for the last few years. But as we know, this year it's particularly difficult, and I think it's a huge challenge. Already almost half of the year has gone. We have 7 months left. I think the government needs to do a lot of things to try to save this economy, and particularly the job market. I think if the job market is not doing well, these are elements of instability. I mean, let's just be honest with that, especially with the college students. So I think it's a daunting task. It's a big challenge, and I think the government needs to go out of their way, to be exceptionally creative, trying to save this economy. Otherwise, we're going to be in deep trouble.
Well, one day, of course, the stabilization of the economy, recovery of the economy will be the key to the creation of jobs. If you look at the PMI, Purchasing Managers Index for the manufacturing sector, for example, it clocked like a 49.6 in May. That's actually up 2.2% from April. So tell us, what's the PMI? What does this number mean?
So PMI is an indicator showing how active the industrial activities are. And now it is an improvement from April, but still in contraction. If the number is below 50, especially when it's below 45, it just means the economic activity, industrial activities are particularly weak. So that's not the most scary part, though. When we talk about those productions, ultimately we're looking at the job creation. And in a sub-indicator under PMI, we have seen a willingness to hire to decline across the board, not just the smaller producers, but also large producers. And recently, we've also heard a lot of news that digital platforms are starting to lay off their workers, and some of them are laying off a lot of workers. And these are sending out pretty bad signals to the market. But I'm not saying we should blame those companies, because every company has to be responsible for its own profit. But then the government or in some other mechanism has to work to encourage those companies to retain workers, either by subsidies or by pension cut or social security cut, or whatever it takes. Otherwise, I'm afraid it's not just 10 million fresh college graduates. Let's not forget there's also the 500,000 vocational school graduates. And then there's another 11 million high school graduates. A lot of those people are still looking for a job as well. They're not all going to college or stay in school. And combine all those, that just show this picture of an unprecedented tight labor market. And that is the number one reason why we need high growth.
Mm-hmm. Well, Wang Dan, still give us the big picture of the economy. Like we know the government, has a goal of a 5.5% GDP growth for this year. So more challenges probably to achieve that goal if we can do that at all.
Oh yes, that goal is still in place. So we haven't heard anything from the top leadership that they're going to abandon this 5.5 GDP growth target, which means in the second half of the year, the macro policy has to be quite aggressive. I can see several things to be done. One is to cut policy rate greatly, because right now the private sector still faces a very high nominal borrowing rate. It's important to lower the cost for them. And number two is in property market. The three red lines have basically choked the entire real estate investment. And some of the measures can be relaxed, and there are a lot of consensus in academia, in the industry. It won't cause a lot of risks, but it will create a lot of jobs, and that's what we need. And then on top of that, of course, we have the infrastructure spending.
Okay.
But that's...
We have to stop there. Thank you, Wang Dan. With that, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks again to our guests. You can also find us at the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.